So today we have our friend Chase the Light.
So let's get started.
Let's get started, bro.
That's good. Yep, so essentially this presentation is going to be a quick overview, essentially a one-on-one on getting started as a automator and a bot racer. So yeah, let's get started with that. Okay, so first of all, I'm just going to quickly introduce myself. I'm Chaser Light, and I built Light Chaser, which is a custom order bot built from scratch with over 900 detectors. And I'm currently the highest placing bot racer for 2024 on Code Arena. And I've so far competed in over 60 bot races. I'm also providing security automations for both Codehawks and Cantina, amongst some other firms as well. Okay, so a quick overview of what is bot racing slash Web3 security automation. So Web3 security automation is essentially using automated tools to find vulnerabilities within code. This could obviously be Solidity. It could also be Rust if you have a Rust-based bot. And this essentially really started with the OGs of the space, both Slither and Mithril. Slither, which was developed by Trailbit, that was, I believe, the first or one of the first Web3 security automation tools that was open source. And of course, you also have Mithril, which I believe, I'm not 100% sure, but I believe was developed by Consensus. And of course, you also have Analyzer, which was developed by PyCodes. And this is probably the most popular bot that bot racers build their detectors on top of and use to actually compete on Code Arena. But you also have some newer open source tools such as Cyfrin and Aderyn, which is which is also a really exciting tool because you kind of get the complexity and power of something like Slither, but then you get the speed advantages that you get from Rust because Cypher and Aderyn is completely Rust based. So of course, you have Lightchaser v4 as well, which is my own tool. Okay, so why is Web3 security automation needed? Why is it necessary? So, in my opinion, the number one advantage of Web3 security automation is its coverage. Because with Web3 security automations, you have the potential to essentially scan thousands of code bases for thousands of different issues at the same time, which isn't the kind of coverage that you can necessarily get as a manual auditor, because you can only look at one particular code base at any given time, and you don't necessarily have thousands of different vulnerabilities in your head simultaneously as you're reading the code. So thanks to the high coverage, you often see that automated reports generated by these tools have 100 plus findings. And this is exceptionally beneficial in reducing blind spots because at the extremely high coverage of automation essentially reduces, it doesn't guarantee, but it definitely reduces the risk of a vulnerability essentially falling through the cracks, especially the obvious blatant ones.
And I also feel that for large code bases, this is very, important, very functional. I mean, sometimes you have 50 contracts to analyze and the bot does that much better.
Absolutely. So, like, one of the projects I worked on recently, I believe it was 200 different contract files. So it was a
Wow.
big.
Was that Windows on Ethereum?
No, not quite. I don't know what the protocol was exactly like. I don't know why I had so many contract files, but because Lightchess is a fully automated tool, it was obviously able to essentially scan for like 900 plus different findings over the entire code base. Which again, for the time period, which was I believe it only took 20 minutes for it to generate the report. That's not necessarily that you can say for manual auditing. If you were to audit a protocol of that size manually, it would take you a lot longer than 20 minutes.
One question for you, bro. One question for
Yeah,
you
of course.
here. How do you work with the references between different files? So let's say contracts talk to each other. I have a chain of contracts. During the automation, you have a process of, referencing back to those contracts, or the bot looks more at one contract itself, or it tries to make, chain processes, instantiate different contracts and everything.
Everything is essentially connected to each other, and doing a particular vulnerability detector, you can actually specify it to essentially reference code that's not within the code block that the vulnerability. If you have any experience with AST,
Yeah.
you know how in AST you have get parent and stuff like that?
Yeah.
Definitely has that capability as well. So
incredible.
And yeah, that can be very useful for larger code bases as well. Yeah, so another huge advantage is speed. So like I mentioned, one of the previous work which I've done was 200 plus contract files. But despite that, Lightchaser and automation in general was able to provide a automated report within 20 minutes. And like I mentioned, if you were to manually audit a code base of that size, it would take a lot longer than 20 minutes, with the caveat that
A lot long.
do tend to be a lot longer, but we're talking months and months. But with the caveat that manual auditors have an exception, especially skilled ones, have an exceptionally high complexity ceiling, in the sense that they are very, very, very good at finding extremely complex and nuanced bugs, which is not something that you can necessarily say for automation in general. And yeah, another huge advantage of automation is once you've built the actual automation itself, because of how scalable it is, it is also reflected in essentially its pricing, its cost. So for what you get in terms of the amount of vulnerabilities found, automated reports can be exceptionally cost effective. And these automated reports can also be used outside of the vulnerability to find themselves to actually help save manual auditors time. Because let's say you're a manual auditor and you're going through a piece of code and you found, let's say, a low severity finding. As a manual auditor, you will also kind of have to go through the rest of the code base and see if that particular vulnerability exists anywhere else. And that is essentially time taken away from you that you could have spent looking for those very high value, very high impact, high and critical vulnerability findings that manual auditors excel in. And so this is especially important nowadays where audits tend to be time boxed. You might get a client and you might only have 1 week or 2 weeks to produce the final audit, and you don't really want to spend time essentially finding and reporting these lower severity findings. You can let the automation take care of that. And it can also help you find those high critical severity findings, because automation has such a wide coverage, it can essentially be used to identify weak points within a code base. And I sadly don't remember exactly which manual auditor said this, but it was said that a high severity finding is usually a combination of medium and low findings. So you can essentially get a automated audit report, go over all the findings, and see if you can actually combine those findings together to actually find something of a higher severity or a higher impact. And there are also some comparative audit specific advantages as well, such as reduced judging time. Because let's say you're a judge on a particular comparative platform and you're looking at a vulnerability submission. You can essentially cross-reference that with the known issues report, and if it exists within the report, you can straight away just go on to the next finding. So this has the potential to save judges a lot of time. And another huge advantage of using this in the comparative audit space is that it can actually help increase the high and medium payouts for those very valuable findings. So let's say you have a HM pool and there are 5 unique findings. Of those 5 unique findings, 3 of them are relatively simple and easy to detect. Stuff, let's say, relating to with ERC20 interactions or unchecked returns for particular functions, stuff along those lines. So those vulnerabilities might actually be valid in terms of the severity. They may be valid mediums, for example, but because of how simple they are to find and how straightforward they may be, they can kind of take away the reward of from the very unique and protocol-specific findings. So by having essential automation take care of those, find all of those, the manual auditors can focus on finding those, like I mentioned, high-impact, unique findings. And yeah, obviously you get paid more because the complexity ceiling against manual auditors. And yeah, so expanding on this, where and when are bots being used? So of course you know about the code arena bot races, which is probably the most popular place where they're being used right now. And of course for other auditing audit bots are also being used as known issue lists for those as well. And they're by no means a replacement for manual audits, but rather in terms of the auditing process in general. In my opinion, automated audits aren't a replacement for manual audits, rather they're an additional pillar in the overall process. So even in my official copy, which I share with my clients, I don't essentially advertise LightChaser as a standalone thing that's supposed to replace manual audits. Rather, in my eye, in my vision, I see it as the first stage that protocol should go through in the overall security journey. So first of all, you get your automated report, followed by a team manual report, followed by a competitive audit, and finally a bug bounty program. And yeah, so there are some stark market differences between manual auditing and automated auditing. One of which is, in my opinion, the competition can be a lot higher. And the reason for this is primarily due to the scalability of automation. So let's say you have an automated tool that is the best in the market or amongst the best in the market. You have far more scope for higher market dominance because you can essentially scale out this automation to take the entire market that's within the realms of possibility. Whereas if you're an exceptional manual auditor, you are still limited by the fact that you can only look at one code base at any given time. That's why you often see these top manual auditors are fully booked for months and months and months. It's because, like Trust Security said, that these top manual auditors can't be Dockerized and efficiently scaled, whereas automation can be Dockerized and efficiently scaled. So this kind of makes it far more of a winner takes all market. And this is definitely something you need to keep in mind because this high competition makes it so that you have to keep on innovating and keep on developing your program. And you never really get any sort of rest. And I'm talking 100% from first-hand experience that you have to keep on building because even if you stop building for a relatively short period of time, let's say just 1 month, that is enough for you to fall behind because a close friend of mine who's a fellow automator, he was one of the top bot racers on Code Arena, but he had to take a step back for a couple of months to work on something else. So it was just a small period of time, it was just 2 or 3 months, or if that. But when he came back, his bot wasn't even capable of qualifying anymore. That's how much the space had moved forward whilst he was simply working on his other stuff. And that kind of real world example shows how competitive the space is, that there is no time for you to focus on anything else. You kind of have to all in on automation, at least in my opinion. It's extremely fast paced in that regard. And one last thing which I really do feel is important to mention is that currently, unlike manual auditing, there isn't yet a fully established market for automated reports. Because it's generally well known amongst protocols that, okay, once you develop your your protocol, you have to get a couple of manual audits done, and that is becoming more of a standardized process that protocols, especially the main ones, follow. The same can't necessarily be said for security automation, at least not yet. And I personally feel this is because, as cliche as it sounds, I do feel we are extremely early in terms of security automation. We're not even at the point where there's an established market. So I do feel, of course, this is just my assumption, is not guaranteed to be true, but I do feel this is kind of like the calm before the storm, because I feel once protocols essentially it becomes part of their standard process in terms of their overall security journey, the demand for security automation in Web3 will skyrocket within the next year or two. Of course, with Lightchase, I am trying to help push that narrative as well. And yeah, so a crucial mindset, if you do decide to get into automation, and I feel that this mindset is extremely important. And from my point of view, I always see it as a prerequisite. So when I started bot racing around this time last year, and we would get the results for a particular bot race. In the so judging criteria was used instead of this judging criteria, which I feel should have been used. And essentially, that was the general narrative which I had until I read this quote from Alex, the entrepreneur, who is one of the judges on Code Arena. My interpretation of this post was, make it your goal to build something that is so powerful and competent that it doesn't matter who is reviewing your work or who is judging your work, your automation will win regardless. And I kind of made that my number one goal from then on out. Instead of blaming particular results on judging criteria or this or that, I was like, no, regardless of what the criteria is, I have to make my work essentially good enough that no matter what, it still performs well. And which is why I wanted to share this with you, because this was exceptionally useful to me. And it was almost a turning point. And I feel like after this, the rate of improvement that I went through was far higher. So a huge shout out to Alex. This was extremely helpful for me.
Always challenging folks. Alex is very good.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, his advice, top notch, in my opinion. I'm going to quickly drink some water.
No problem.
Awesome. I'm good to go. Okay, so once you kind of have the general mindset and kind of know what the market looks like, it's time to actually get building and get your bot racer ready for competitions. So the first part of your bot racing journey is essentially picking your buyer, choosing what route you want to go down. So currently, I personally feel there are two main routes. There's the open source route, which is essentially building on top of an already existing tool which has been open sourced. Of course, Analyzer comes to mind, and Cyfrin and Aderyn also comes to mind. And the second main approach is the path which I went down, which is building from scratch. And these two approaches have their own unique advantages. So with the open source path, you essentially save yourself the trouble from essentially reinventing the wheel, because you don't want to be in a position where you are putting a lot of work into a program which kind of exists in the open source realm. And this kind of reduces, essentially going with the open source route, you reduce the time that it takes from you deciding, okay, I want to be a bot racer, to actually racing itself, because you do not have to build the underlying framework. So it's a far faster essential turnover from idea, I want to be a bot racer, to actually becoming one. But the the flip side of that is I feel there's a very unique advantage that you get from building your bot from scratch, and that is two main things. One is the control that you have on the framework, and the two is your almost limitless complexity ceiling. So if you build from scratch, um, it goes without saying that you're going to know your code, your framework, like the back of your hand, because you literally wrote the entire thing. And that will obviously allow you the full value, the full power out of your framework, more so that I feel you would be able to get if you're building on top of a framework that someone else or another dev team built. A second huge advantage is the complexity ceiling. So because you built that framework from scratch, the prospect of you building on top of it and making it more powerful, making it more advanced, is far more apparent. And I know this firsthand from Lightchaser because I even built the parser from scratch. And the V or upgrades in particular, I personally don't feel would have been possible had I, for example, used an open source AST instead of building my own parser. But yeah, that's of course personal opinion as well. And so a third kind of approach is the hybrid, where you essentially use an open source framework, but not only do you develop the detectors on top of that framework, but you also tweak the underlying framework itself. So that way you kind of get the best of both worlds in a way, but I'd still feel that you don't get the full control that you can get as building your bot completely from scratch. And lastly, it's LLM based bot essentially. So when doing the bot racing first started, a huge amount of the initial batch of qualifying bots were LLM based, and essentially bots that use stuff like, for example, ChatGPT. So obviously, I'm personally quite skeptical, but from what I've seen, being a bot racer myself, and also observing my fellow bot racers, static analysis still seems to be the way to go in terms of skill to automation. However, I do feel there's another huge scope that I need, which is instead of using LLMs to find the vulnerabilities themselves, I feel that they can be used to help you build your detectors. Not code the detectors themselves, but essentially they can be, from my experience, be used to help you brainstorm different edge cases and different scenarios for particular vulnerabilities. A very simple, straightforward example of this is, let's say I have a simple detector that sees if message.value is being used within a for loop, right? So let's say I'm kind of using LLM as my personal assistant and using it to help flesh out different edge cases and different scenarios. It may come back to me and say, hey, you haven't taken while loops into account. So it's very good at helping you spot these little essentially situations that you may not have thought of, or you may have simply just forgotten about. Another great way in which they can be used is essentially writing descriptions, because if you have 400 detectors which you have to build, essentially typing out a description for every single one can be quite time consuming. LLMs can definitely help you there as well. So you can essentially provide a skeleton description for a particular vulnerability to the LLM and essentially ask it to elaborate on it and make it very readable and easy to understand. And it usually gives you a pretty good response. But do keep in mind, LLMs like to hallucinate, so always double check wherever it's spitting out to make sure it's factually correct. And another downside, which I do feel I should definitely mention, is LLMs do tend to provide very robotic sounding descriptions. So it's abundantly clear that a LLM produced a particular description. So that's another thing which you have to keep in mind. But yeah, in terms of using them to find vulnerabilities themselves, like I mentioned, I am definitely on the skeptical side of that. But I do feel like one of the reasons for that is they tend to produce a very large amount of false positives, and there's almost a point where the amount of time it takes for you to essentially filter out the false positives from the LLM's output makes it so that you might have been better off manually writing that report instead, if that makes sense. That's something to keep in mind. Don't completely discard LLMs, because there's also the chance that I simply haven't figured out how to use it in the ideal way. So definitely do experiment with it as well. Yep. So once you've kind of decided whether or not you're going to build on top of an open source board or you're going to build completely from scratch, you can kind of move on to the next stage, which is essentially getting your critical mass of detectors. So, especially for code arena ball races, even if you have let's say a small handful, let's say 10 or 20 exceptionally cool, exceptionally powerful detectors, you still may not be able to qualify, because let's say your bot with your really cool detectors is able to find 10 valid lows, or 10 or 5 valid lows on 5 valid mediums, or something along those lines. But you're up against another bot that didn't find any lows or any mediums, but has like 150 valid gas and non-critical findings. Because each finding is given points individually, you may still fall behind in terms of points against that bot. And you don't want to be in that situation. You want your powerful, awesome detectors to shine. So you need to have a underlying foundation of detectors, of which once you have, then you start building your unique, cool detectors. At least that's what I generally recommend to new bot racers, because even if you have those really cool detectors, nobody will see them if you don't meet the points criteria, because the way qualifiers currently work is that you have to get 60% or higher the points of the winning report. So you definitely need to have that as well. But this can be exceptionally time consuming, because 400 detectors is not a small amount. So this step alone, I feel, can take you 3 to 4 months. And if you are building your own framework from scratch, that can further extend the period from another 3 to 4 months as well. And these 400 detectors, I personally recommend that the number one place to look are path bot reports. And the reason for this is quite simple. Every potentially automatable findings, you have them all there, and you already have a POC of what automated that particular vulnerability would look like, because you have the report. Yeah, awesome. Okay, so once you have your base forward, so currently I feel there are two main methodologies in play in bot racing in general. So the first one is bots which focus primarily on coverage. So these are essentially bots that have a lot of detectors and a lot of innovative, cool detectors, but so they are capable of finding a wider variety of different vulnerabilities, but at the expense of accuracy. Then you have the other camp, quote-unquote camp, which is the accuracy-based bots, which have fewer detectors, but the detectors which do trigger tend to produce far lower false positives. So you essentially almost need to ask yourself is, what do you value more? Do you value low false negatives more, or you value low false positives more? And that isn't something that I can decide for you. That's totally up to you. But in an ideal world, you will not have to make that compromise. Ideally, your bot will have both high coverage with low false negatives, with high accuracy with low false positives. But in order to reach that ideal, I personally believe it depends on four primary criteria. One is speed, because you may have a detector which can fully capture a particular vulnerability, all the different edge cases, all the different scenarios, and is exceptionally accurate, but it could take a lot of computational power. So it extends the computation, the generation time for your report. And I know this firsthand because I'd say 80% of the time is taken by 20% of my detectors for light chaser. So let's say a particular report takes 100 seconds to generate. Out of the 100 seconds, 80 seconds was due to only 20% of my detectors. So that is definitely a compromise that you need to keep in mind, because if all of your detectors take a lot of computational power, you might actually end up at a point where you might not even be able to participate in the bot race because your bot takes far too long to actually generate the report, and you only have a 1 hour submission window. So, the second thing which reaching this ideal of both high coverage and high accuracy depends on is how much time can you dedicate to each individual detector. Because of course, the higher quality your detectors are, the more time they take to develop. It makes sense for it to work that way. And the reason why this is something that you may have to compromise on is, let's say you are at the early stages, you are building the initial 400 detector foundation, but each one of your detectors takes, let's say, 2 or 3 hours to develop. Then the likelihood of you reaching that critical mass of detectors is far lower, because it might take you such a long period of time to actually get there that you might never get to compete. So that's another thing we definitely need to keep in mind. But a small caveat there is, once you got your foundation, is you don't necessarily need to compromise, because I am building some V4 detectors, and those are far more time intensive in terms of how much time I need to spend developing them. But because I have that underlying 800, 900 plus detectors, I can afford to spend a lot more time on my newer, more advanced detectors. And the third thing is obviously experience, because it makes perfect sense that the more time you spend doing a particular skill, the better you get at it. So the more experience you become at building security or Web3 security detectors, the easier it is for you to get closer to the high coverage, high accuracy ideal, because thanks to your past experience, you know what high quality detectors looks like. So I know this firsthand as well with Light Chaser. The early detectors, in particular the V1 and V2 detectors, were far less accurate than the ones which I built on V3 and V4. And a huge part of that is obviously the underlying framework, but another factor is, of course, the experience, because I'm far after building like nearly 1,000 detectors, you get pretty good at it, and building high quality detectors becomes far more feasible. And the fourth and last dependency, most important factors to consider, because if your underlying framework doesn't allow you to fully capture a particular vulnerability with high accuracy, then that almost acts as a bottleneck or a complexity ceiling of what your automation is capable of. This is one I didn't want to make the compromise. I didn't want to compromise between coverage and accuracy. I essentially wanted to build a framework that could do both. And that was kind of the guiding mission statement for V4. That's another thing which you definitely need to keep in mind when you are developing your detectors and choosing what underlying framework to build on, or building one of your own. Okay, so in general, if you want to gauge the value of a detector, I personally base it on 3 key criteria. Number one is the severity, because it goes without saying that a high severity finding in the bot report is far more valuable than a non-critical or a gas finding. So that's the first, essentially, part of the overall equation. The secondly is accuracy, because even if you have a very good detector of a high severity, if 90% of its results are false positives, then the overall value of the detector is definitely lower, because it almost gets to a point where, like I mentioned before, you might as well just manually look for that finding instead, because the time it takes for you to filter through the false positives makes it almost not worth it to detect it through your tool. And the third and final key criteria is the trigger rate. And let's say you have two detectors. You have one medium detector, which triggers on 10% of code bases. And then you have a high severity detector, a high vulnerability detector, which only detects in 0.1% of code bases. There was definitely an argument that in terms of automation, the medium the medium detector would be more valuable because it triggers more often and essentially gains you value on more code bases. But there is an exception. And this exception is that, let's say you are a end protocol, an end client, and you receive two automated reports. One has, let's say, 5 lows and 5 mediums, but the other one only has one finding, but that one finding is a valid critical. So a huge argument can be made that from the client's perspective, from the end user's perspective, a report that only had that one critical finding could be deemed more valuable than the other report for one simple fact. That critical finding directly saved that protocol. It's essentially its TVL. So it saved both it and its users money. And so that's definitely something you have to keep in mind when you are developing detectors, that it's sometimes worth still building a lot of low trigger rate detectors for that particular reason. Okay, so now you should hopefully have your critical mass of detectors, and on top of that, you have your own unique detectors, which essentially make your bot stand out and win competitions and score high. So now it's time to put your bot to work, and obviously the way that we're going to discuss primarily is coding the bot races. So the first thing which you have to do as a coder bot racer is qualify, because not anyone, it's not an open competition. It's not that anybody can compete. You have to first qualify, and there are only 20 spots available on Code Arena in terms of bot races. So essentially what happens is every month or two, for a particular Code Arena order competition, there's a bot race qualifier. And the way it works is, once that competition starts, there is a 1 hour submission window at the start of the contest for you to essentially run your bot against the competition, audit code base, and submit the report to Code Arena. You don't submit it through an MD file, you submit it through a specific JSON format, but that JSON format is publicly available. The schema is also available as well, so definitely take a look at that. But essentially what happens then is, alongside the qualifier round, there is the usual bot race, which also takes place. So all of the qualifier bots which are trying to qualify get compared to the winning bot of the general bot racing competition. So let's say the bot racing cent or higher of the winning bot report, which in this case has 100 points. So you will have to get at least 60 points or higher to qualify. But there are limited slots. So even though, let's say, there are 5 bot racers who qualified, if there are only 2 slots available, the top 2 out of that batch, only they will be selected. But one quick thing I quick want to go over is that it is actually quite standard and normal for you to not qualify the first time round. The majority of the new bot racers who have qualified, they did not qualify first time. It usually takes 2 or 3 times, 2 or 3 qualifiers for you to finally qualify. So in order to essentially shorten that journey, there are two main things which you need to do. The first thing is you will usually receive feedback from the judge who judged the qualifying bots, and you have to go through that feedback, and every single detector that was either not scored or penalized, essentially fix them so such that the next time they trigger, wherever issue that they had that made them produce a false positive, which resulted in penalization, it doesn't happen in future races. And the second thing which you have to do is look at the winning report and go through every single finding and essentially ask yourself, why didn't my bot find that particular finding? And there are two usual scenarios. One is that the way you coded your detector for that particular vulnerability didn't take that particular scenario or edge case into account. And the second reason is you simply didn't have the detector at all in the first place. So by doing that, you essentially go over the winning report and you add all the detectors that you're missing and you mend the ones that were broken. If you do that enough times, you will eventually qualify. And once you qualify, you can start competing and actually earning from your work. But there is a second barrier, which is getting essentially your first grade A, because from what I've seen is a lot of bots which qualify, they don't straight away start getting grade A's. A lot of the times they get grade B's and C's for the first few reports. Then obviously they catch up to the rest of the bots and they start performing pretty well. And yeah, kind of building on the mindset which I mentioned earlier. I personally feel that if you are going to compete, you should aim to win. I personally think that that would give you the best results over the long run by far. And also do keep in mind that, like I mentioned, bots require constant maintenance. You always have to keep on adding new detectors, the ones that you are missing, and on top of that, new ones that you find on your own as well. And you have to keep on mending faulty detectors. And I don't feel that there will ever be a point where you will have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of detectors and all of them are 100% accurate. You will always have to keep on mending detectors, but you only figure out are faulty for particular situations or edge cases. And one important thing which I also feel like I should mention is the current state of bot racing. So everything which I've mentioned thus far was with the current Cold Arena bot race essentially setup, like how things work currently. However, you may have noticed that recently there hasn't been any bot races. In fact, since the last bot race qualifier, there hasn't been a single one, which is over a month now, I believe. And does that mean that bot racing is done? In my personal, of course, I can't guarantee anything, but in my personal opinion, I don't feel this is the case. What I personally feel will happen is that the bot races will essentially go through a complete overhaul and then come back in full force. So essentially getting started now could potentially put you in a very good position benefit from the future of bot racing if that series turns out to be the case, which I personally feel that's what's going to happen. But of course, the caveat is that the rules which I mentioned now may not necessarily apply to bot racing 2.0, for example. So do keep that in mind. Bot racing may change completely, and it may work in a completely different way. But despite that, there are still a lot of exciting, essentially new opportunities in the Web3 security automation space where you can essentially put your automation skills to work. And one of which is something which I'm really excited to announce, which is Cyfrin's Aderyn contest. So Cyfrin will be holding an automation contest in partnership with Scroll. And essentially what the contest is, like I mentioned, they have their own open source tool called Aderyn. The contest is $5,000. And a really cool aspect of this competition is that it's a public good. So all the detectors which are developed as part of this contest will be added to the public repository, which essentially means that all protocols, all security researchers can benefit from your detector. The the date is looking to be 24th of April, but I would definitely keep an eye on Cyfrin's official socials and for the official announcement, because this is actually quite an early announcement. But definitely use that to your advantage to get a head start in developing detectors for Aderyn. There's definitely some exciting stuff coming in that regard. Yeah, but let me finally, I just quickly want to go over some other benefits of becoming an automator, which may not be as readily apparent. So, in my personal opinion, becoming an automator is actually an excellent way of learning manual auditing. Because in order for you to fully capture a particular vulnerability in a detector, you need to know that vulnerability like the back of your hand. And not only that, essentially by building a detector, you are, in a way, teaching a bot, a robot, to find that particular vulnerability. And as we know, teaching is one of the best ways to learn something. But I feel that this could actually be a very unique path to actually becoming a manual auditor as well. That's definitely something worth exploring, in my opinion. And like I mentioned with the previous contest, there's a potential for you to bring benefit to the space, because let's say you build a detector for an open source tool, and that detector is you open a pull request and that detector gets added. Essentially, provided that detector has a very low false negative rate and a very low false positive rate, you, in a way, have almost eliminated that particular bug from future code bases, because any development team can essentially clone that repo, run against that code, and hopefully preemptively find those bugs before they actually go live. So you have a lot of potential to do a lot of good for Web3 security and Web3 space in general. And I feel like I can't say that without giving a huge shout out to both PyCodes and Robbie, because he contributed many detectors to the analyzer tool, and he definitely deserves a huge shout out for that. That was super awesome of him. And yeah, lastly, I quickly want to talk about that the fact that I feel there will be a huge growing demand for automators in general. There's essentially no hiding from the fact of how popular AI and automation has become in the recent months, recent years, especially with LLMs and everything. So I feel that because of that, the demand for automators will skyrocket. And essentially, becoming a Web3 security automator, it gives you an opportunity to really showcase your skills. Because let's say you make your CV, or you're applying for a particular role, not only can you add your academic and your work experience on your CV or your application, whatever it may be, you can also proudly say that I competed on an international leaderboard, and for Web3 security automation, I placed so and so. And that would definitely do nothing but help your case in terms of getting an automation engineer role in the future. Definitely something to think about as well. And yeah, so some final closing thoughts. Always keep in mind that Web3 security automation is by no means easy. It's extremely competitive, and it is exceptionally time intensive. And you need a huge upfront time investment as well, just to get started, just to essentially be on the playing field. And so that's definitely something that you have to ask yourself: am I willing to go through that huge amount of work, huge amount of effort to become a full-fledged Web3 security automator? And not only that, with Web3 security automation, like I mentioned before, you kind of get into a state where you can't take breaks, because the space moves so exceptionally fast that even if you take a relatively short break from developing your tooling, your Web3 security automation tool, like let's say 2 or 3 months, you run the risk of falling behind your fellow automators who haven't taken any breaks and have kept on working on their craft. But in terms of what you can achieve, both in impact and also financially as well, due to the scalability of automation, and it's definitely something that you capitalize on. But yeah, in terms of some new awesome automation alpha, I do actually have some more stuff in the works, which I sadly can't share right in the future. But that's pretty much it for me.
Brother, that was an amazing presentation. Thank you so much. This will help a lot of people regarding, how hard it is to start, and we need to start. I mean, it's a hustle, right? There's no easy money, especially in Web3. I thought that by looking at Twitter, we become very biased because we see all these numbers, but for everybody, it's a huge fight. Everyone at the top is making a lot of work to be there. So thank you so much for giving us a peek into that. I really wish I could see the code for the bot, but I know how much work you put into that, and this is not something we just share like that. But I hope one day we get to see it. And thank you so much. You have any messages you want to give to people that will see this in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say as cliche as it sounds, with Web2 security automation, it really is one of those things that you kind of have to stick with it for a very long period of time to finally get the fruits of your work. So if in the short run you aren't really getting results, or your bot isn't necessarily performing well, don't let that dishearten you. With building something that complex, it's completely normal for it to take many, many iterations for it to get to a point where you can actually start to capitalize and essentially enjoy the fruits of your labor. So yeah, that's
amazing, bro. That's Chase the Light rocking the house on Open Sense. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Chase, and talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.